to be joined by Dr. Jenny Wang, who is a Taiwanese American clinical psychologist and national speaker on the intersections of Asian American identity, mental health, and intergenerational and racial trauma. Her professional mission is to destigmatize mental health within the Asian American community and empower Asian Americans to prioritize their own mental well-being. She's also spearheaded the Asians for Mental Health Therapist Directory, asiansformentalhealth.com, to connect individuals with culturally relevant mental health care for Asian American diasporas. She also created an Instagram community, Asians for Mental Health, which you can follow, which I've also followed, where she explores the unique ways in which Asian American identity impacts our mental health. Her first book, which we'll dive right into soon, is called Permission to Come Home, Reclaiming Mental Health as Asian Americans, was published in May 2022. And lastly, she is also a mental health advisory member of Wondermind and the Mental Health Coalition. So to start us off, can you tell us a bit about your book, Permission to Come Home, and sort of the inspiration behind it?
Yeah, so I think the inspiration came from realizing through the Instagram account that people wanted to explore how their backgrounds, their family stories, their cultural elements informed mental health. And when I started the Instagram account, I think it was in late 2019, there were lots of mental health related accounts, but there were not mental health accounts that focused on unique immigrant experiences or experiences of children of color and Asian Americans. And so initially the goal of the account was just to build a directory. I was literally DMing people who were Asian American therapists, trying to get them to join this directory so we could have a focused place for people to look for mental health professionals that reflected who they were. But as I was posting and sharing just my internal thoughts, I realized that people were really craving and hoping for a mental health book that really centered the experiences of Asian diaspora. And I fully recognize that there are limits to any singular book in kind of sharing the experiences, because our Asian American community is so wide and so diverse and comprises of so many different cultural backgrounds. And yet at the same time, there were themes that seemed to run across clients that I was working with. Or when I would do my corporate speaking, people would say, oh, that resonated, and I'm from this background. And so I think there's this idea that could we offer people a tool where they could ask themselves the questions that I might ask in a therapy room? They might start to challenge some of the frameworks that sometimes keeps us stuck.
That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. That's incredible. Thank you for sharing. I think one of my favorite chapters in your book is the permission to take up space. And I really love how you sort of connect the concept of taking up space with the concept of limited Asian American political representation and for people of color and immigrants. So can you speak a little bit more about this?
Absolutely. I think representation has many psychological effects on a person, in the sense that when you see someone in a position or in a place that is well regarded, has some sense of influence or impact, it can inspire us to believe that we are capable of similar things. And so I think on the one hand, representation helps us dream about what's possible in one's life. But also representation means that perhaps this person might also be invested in elevating the experiences and voices of people who might look like them or identify similarly. And so when I think about this idea of taking up space, it almost holds in tension fear and courage at the same time, right? Because I can try to take up space and still be kind of scared about what that might cost me, how people might react, while also holding on to the courage and belief that I actually deserve to be seen and heard. And so I think back to my own parents when they came to the United States, and I remember them feeling that sense of we don't really belong here. And they had unique experiences that gave them that type of feedback, right? Be it a racist remark, be it discriminatory interactions at work. There were almost these constant reminders that you are perhaps not safe and that your environment is not really invested in keeping you safe or protecting you. And so when we fail to see political representation then at the higher levels, it also makes us wonder, well, who will speak for us? Who will take care of us and protect us? And so in response, when we feel psychologically unsafe, is that we will do what we can to protect and self-preserve. And one of the strategies is to stay under the radar. I remember as a child, my parents saying, hey, don't speak up, don't be too loud, don't make trouble. Just exist under the radar so that you can get through schooling, get a job, and build stability. And I think with our parents' experiences, that made sense. Because for some of our parents, they came with very little stability. So that was the goal, right? Was to be able to say, we perhaps own our home and we perhaps have some financial resources that we can rely on. And I think being, the eldest daughter, being a child of immigrants, I internalized those messages as stay small. Don't take up too much space because people might actually react negatively to you in response. And I think about the times where even my parents, in their anger, if they were discriminated against, they couldn't even fight back because they didn't have mastery of the English language. And so their silence, even if it was not what they wanted to be, in some ways, it protected them, right? It allowed them to stay in the shadows, or like I like to say, in the margins. And I think that was a trauma response, right? It is a let me self-protect by making myself invisible almost. And so in some ways, I feel like it's not a surprise that Asian Americans have sometimes been described as the invisible race, where we are seen as not having been through some of the atrocious, right, histories and stories of Black and Brown communities, but we also do not hold the privileges and rights of white communities. And so we almost are seen as somewhere in the in-between, where our race actually doesn't matter to society that much. And yet post-pandemic, we've seen that it matters a lot because it has been used as a source of, or a point of harm, right? And so when I think about taking up space, and as we begin to see more representation of Asian Americans in politics, in media, and leadership, in corporate spheres, I think it gives us a little bit more courage to take up some of that space in the spaces that we might have influence over.
That's so powerful. Thank you for sharing. So I was a past sort of educator and went to one of a coalition event for API educators, and one person was asked, like how were you navigating this space without somebody sort of that like looks like you that you could look up to. And she responded along the lines of something where she said like I was waiting. I was like the hero that I was like waiting for. So really appreciate you speaking about this representation as a means of dreaming, as a means of expanding the realm of what's possible. Um, so so the next question I wanted to ask was I sort of worry about my own parents, and you spoke about this this lack of agency earlier in response to acts of discrimination. Um, and I worry as they age, they might feel vulnerable to feelings of isolation and weaken social connections. You talk a bit about the emotions, namely shame, and the cultural value of saving face. And I think that's I think what I'm grappling with when I think about my parents asking for help is this idea of stoicism when faced with inner turmoil and sort of that response. So how have you navigated discussions around mental health with your own parents, and what have you found to be the most helpful?
I kind of think of our work kind of for our generation in the like 20s, 30s, 40s in relating to mental health and our parents as a constant journey that we're on, because this is still something that is still so stigmatized within the older generation. And honestly, I think it makes sense in the way that they frame mental health, right? Or how society has always framed mental health in their generation, which is mental health, all of it is quote unquote the extremes, right? So when you say mental health, they're thinking schizophrenia, or they're thinking psychotic break, they're thinking institutionalization, right? And so mental health in their minds is not a normal human experience. It's actually those edges of human experience. And so sometimes I've had to work even with my own parents on reframing the idea of what mental health even is, you know. And I often say, you know, mental health is in the decisions that you make, in how you see your world, how you speak to and relate to another human being, right? Because all of those facets are informed by your mental health state at that moment. And so I think it takes a lot of consistent kind of discussion and education to reframe the idea that mental health is something that we all have, whether or not we recognize it, whether or not we protect it, whether or not we strengthen it. And so if we can help our parents realize that they too have a mental health, and that in certain moments and times in their lives, it can be doing really well, and they can be feeling strong, empowered, connected. And then there will be times in their life where their mental health is not doing well, and they feel alone, scared, anxious, very sad or depressed, right? And that mental health expands and contracts and moves over one's lifetime, right? So then it becomes something that, one, they recognize they have, two, that they actually might have some sort of impact over and choices to make around it. And that it's something that they can build up, right? That they can strengthen. And so I think that's one of the first steps, is reworking the framework or idea of mental health. And then the second thing I would say is that we forget that mental health is something where it's intimately related to physical health and relational health. And so even asking your parents, how are you eating lately? How are you sleeping? Are you doing the hobbies? Are you going on your walks? that you love to have in the mornings? Are you meeting with friends? Those questions inform us about their mental health, right? Because if those things have changed for the worse, then we start to say, oh, why? What could be contributing to that change? So our conversations with mental health don't have to come out of the gate as like, do you feel depressed? Why are you so anxious? What's bothering you, right? Because that can actually shut our parents down, right? Because those are not conversations that they're used to. So could we start as, I noticed that you seem to have lost some weight recently, and you don't seem to be eating the normal amount that you do. Can you share with me what's been going on, right? And that can be the open door to that. Another thing we have to keep in mind is, especially when people are not comfortable sharing their inner world, like some of our parents might struggle with, our consistency matters. So if we try to open the door and they don't step through at that time, that attempt to connect still counts. And the next time we do it, and the further we do it, the more it creates a sense that my child cares about me, my child is interested, and they might be a safe space in which I could explore. So I truly believe that we build the scaffolding for our parents to connect with us regarding their mental health over time. And there is no rush. We don't have to rush people into feeling comfortable with mental health, but that it's something that we can build into our normal conversations day to day.
That's so helpful. Thank you for sharing these very practical tips for building a safe scaffolding to open our older generations to these types of conversations. In one of your chapters entitled Permission to Grieve, you talk about your own experiences with the loss of your grandpa and a sort of subsequent feeling of disconnection from your Taiwanese culture and your cultural lineage. And personally, as a child of immigrants, I often wonder, how can we as Asian Americans continue to build a shared sense of history, cultural and lineage for generations that come after us? And what has that process been like for you and your own children?
Yeah, I think about how I was born in Taiwan, but moved to the United States when I was 2. And already it feels as though Taiwan is kind of a homeland, but not a home, right? So as immigrants, there is this homeland idea in our minds of, where our people are from, where our ancestors built their lives. And depending on your level of, which generation your family immigrated to another country, your connections to that idea of homeland, which has the cultural and ancestral and familial roots, starts to almost get stretched out further and further. And so I think for myself, as my kids, are 10 and 6, one of the things that we've been very deliberate about is building their sense of cultural pride, in the sense of we are proud of who we are and where we come from and the people that we are descendants of. And I think pride in that facet of our identity was something that I actually never had growing up, because coming to the United States, so much of my racial and ethnic framework was informed by white dominance and discrimination. So in fact, my racial and ethnic identity was a very deep source of shame for most of my childhood. It was a place in which I tried to hide. It was a facet of myself that I minimized in service of believing in the systemic structural racism that exists inherently in the United States. And so when I became a parent and was working through my own racial identity and trauma, I realized that I could set the stage from which my kids interpreted their identity. But I couldn't do that unless I had a healthier sense of my own racial identity as well. And so we've been very deliberate at things like having a Taiwan booth at my child's International Day Festival. We've been very deliberate about working with the school to set up a Lunar New Year display. Because there's something about your parents showing you that this is a source of pride versus shame that helps protect them against the narratives that they will invariably face in this world, right? Narratives about their identity that are informed by racism. And so now when we have conversations about their race or their identity, they're coming from a place of knowing that their identity is a cherished part of themselves. And so it becomes much harder to let that be tarnished by, let's say, the comments of "go back to your country" or the comments of, "kung flu." They can see those in the backdrop of systemic racism and say, this is more about you than it is about me. And thereby preserving that identity from being harmed by these discriminatory encounters. And I think, right, so much of our culture is informed by the food, the celebrations, the rituals, the things in which we bring forward to that next generation. And I will have to admit that there is loss even in that. For example, we, over a pandemic, stopped Chinese school for my daughter. And it was such a loss for me because though I didn't enjoy Chinese school as a child myself, I can speak, Mandarin, and I can understand Taiwanese. And so I have that semblance of connection to my culture that my kids will not have because we made the decision to stop Chinese school. And so there's a sense of grief there because I feel like sometimes we can feel as though we're not doing enough to enhance their cultural identity, right? We must do this and it has to look this certain way. And I think we have to realize that our kids are going to grow up as bicultural or multicultural kids. And that there is no rule or no requirement, such as speaking a language or knowing certain cultural elements, that would make them more or less, right, of a certain part of their identity. And so I think letting go of those expectations, letting my child be curious and explore on their own has been one of the most powerful ways to help them lead the path towards cultural development.
That's so beautiful. Yeah, I think that's, I think letting go of the expectations that we hold for what it's supposed to look like when kids are sort of building this for the very first time is a very sort of liberating idea. So appreciate you for sharing that. In your book, you also discuss sort of the importance of 4 concepts: safety, belonging, authenticity, and compassion. And I know they're very interrelated, so to speak. So can you speak to why sort of these concepts might be important for future policymakers to consider, and how might we go about creating these spaces?
Yeah, I almost see these 4 kind of components as them building upon themselves, because I think at the most basic level, if we don't feel psychologically safe, then it's difficult to feel as though you belong and can be authentic. and then can exercise compassion for others. And so I think that for future policymakers, are the people that you serve, do they feel psychologically safe from a needs perspective, right? Do they feel psychologically safe from a sense of self-actualization perspective? Do they have the tools, right, to build that for themselves? I think those are some questions that I would love to explore, because I think as policymakers, in many ways, you are equipped with the systems and resources to build tools that people can then use for themselves, right? And so I think about safety being one. Do people have access to healthy food and secure housing and consistent jobs and transportation to get to those jobs, right? Those are those basic level effects that I think no amount of mental health treatment can get rid of those kind of pressures if they're faced with them. But then I think about the next level of belonging and how policymakers are also, right, part of that too, in terms of the legislation that they enact and the types of laws and governing accountability that we placed on corporations and nonprofits and all of these larger systems that people live within. And so, you think about like the American Disabilities Act and how that it was enacted to protect people. And so belonging, I think, people will feel as they will feel as though they belong if they feel safe in that environment, right? And if they feel as though they will be protected and their needs also, right, being met. And I think when you have safety and you have belonging, then that allows people then to be authentic, right? Because now I can truly show myself. I don't need to be constantly maybe code switching or wearing a mask because I do not feel safe. And I think about, as policymakers, how when they also model authenticity, right, how that affects the constituents and the people that they serve. And then I truly believe that as policymakers, if there is no compassion, then how are we truly serving the people that we represent, right? And compassion is not the same as sympathy, which is, I feel sorry that you're going through this situation. And it's more than empathy, because empathy is I'm alongside you in your difficulties. But compassion is also a sense of I see the difficulty and I may actually be inclined to carry some of that burden alongside. And I think there's something powerful about that idea that if our future policymakers saw themselves as people who carried burdens alongside their constituents, how beautiful that would be in transforming the political landscape.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. That's really love the last piece about moving past sort of or delineating compassion from sympathy and moving from a place of collective well-being or collective sort of a sense of responsibility. So last question here, and we'll leave this broad, but is there anything else you'd like to share with our readers, our listeners, that we haven't already discussed?
Yeah, I think one final thought that I'd love to leave to your readers is that we all have the ability to destigmatize mental health. And I think one of the most tangible ways that we can do that is to simply break the silence around it, And I think that so much of our society is built around this idea that we must look as if we have everything figured out and under control. And I hear this a lot from young adults who are in college or graduate school or young professionals. And in many ways, this generation of young adults have lived their entire lives looking at curated images of what life is. And I think that only feeds the stigma, right? And so if I could ask your readership to do anything, it would be to find spaces in which you could give others the gift of going second. And what I mean by that is when you take on that courageous step of going first, of sharing your vulnerability, of sharing your struggle, you also give others the permission to do the same. And you give them the gift of going second in that journey. And so I invite your readers to try that, to see how it feels, and to perhaps experience the beauty of that process and how it connects them to others.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for that response. And thank you so much for being here. This has been very inspiring. And I have to say thank you so much for all the work that you're doing, that you're pioneering, and letting us all go second and behind your wake. So it's been truly an honor having you here with us at the AAPR. And if you want to hear more about Dr. Jenny Wang, please give her a follow at Asians for Mental Health. And again, thank you.